Welcome to Brain Event. We are delighted to be joined by Sebastian Purcell, who's written a wonderful book on the wisdom of the Aztecs. So one of the things that we really care about doing on Brain Event, and something that we sort of thought about over the last 5 years, is making a gigantic quilt of philosophy so that every little square is sort of slowly filled in. And this is one of those squares that we hadn't even thought of filling in. So it's really wonderful to find out that there's a magical hole in our quilt that we can fill in. Sebastian, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
I'm going to give everyone a classical reference, and then I'm going to give you the student version of it so that you can kind of, I don't know, find a better way in. So the classical reference actually comes from the Odyssey, where I find Odysseus makes a strangely Aztec choice. It's when he's in the island of Calypso. Now, to recall the story, Odysseus takes 10 years to go back, but he ends up spending 7 years on this island with Calypso. She's a goddess, and he doesn't have to work, and it's a pretty nice existence. Despite that, he wants to go back. So the gods send Hermes. Hermes tells Calypso, let him go back home. She says, fine, on one condition, that I get to try to convince him one more time to stay with me. And so you get a scene where Odysseus is seated at a table with Calypso. She's drinking ambrosia, the drinks for the gods. Humans can't eat that. He's eating food. And she says, look, I will give you agelessness and immortality. And he, of course, gets to remain in the romantic company of a goddess for the rest of time, never working, if he agrees to stay with her. And he says, nope, I'm going to leave. Next scene, he's out in the woods chopping down trees and putting together a raft to sail home. He would literally rather die trying to go back to find his wife and child than stay in paradise with a goddess. And it seems initially like it's the opposite of the Garden of Eden story, where Adam and Eve are kicked out of paradise. Odysseus chooses to leave. But I think actually most people would choose something similar. And the way I explain this to my students is I say, look, all right, so assume that, I don't know, you are helping your grandparents clean out their attic, and you find a little silvery lamp, and just for grins, you decide to give it a rub, and lo and behold, the genie pops out, and the genie says, great, releasing me, you don't get any wishes. Here's the deal. I can't just change things. I can give you $1 billion in a bank account. I can make sure you are ageless, immortal. I can make sure that you live your life with another ageless and immortal person who is beautiful for romantic company. All of that I can set up. The downside is, in order to make this work, I'm going to have to whisk you away. I'm in New York, so I tell my students to Chicago or something like that, some other city. And you are never going to see your friends and family again. You can't. They will never know what happened to you. You can't even take your dog. Would you accept the genie's offer? And most students just say no. They're not going to. They feel bad about. They actually feel that they would wrong their friends and family by becoming a sort of missing person. They would never know whatever happened to you. You would just disappear. They feel like there's some sort of harm that they cause. They're unwilling to do that to their friends and family just so that they can go off and lead a pleasurable life, which is effectively what is promised. It's a life of elevated emotional states where you never have to work, right? And if we mean by happiness something like many smiles, in the colloquial sense of happiness, then you are choosing not that life, right? Not a life of happiness. You're choosing something else. And that's the Aztec point. If you would choose like Odysseus, you recognize that we just value some things more than smiles. And in that bare sense of happiness, it's just the case that you're not after happiness. You just think you are. And as a result, for philosophers, then the question is, well, okay, well, we're after some conception of the good life then, and we're going to go cash that out. But it raises that as a topic for discussion. The Aztecs are going to come down on the idea you're really after a rooted life, which they put as their own kind of conception of the good life in the mix of, world views on what we're after. But that's the starting point for their outlook. And I think that that's a useful thought experiment to begin with.
So that's very interesting. What exactly does rootedness mean? Does it mean having long-standing relationships? Going back to the classical case, why doesn't Odysseus's relationship with Calypso count as a rooted relationship?
First of all, his dog's the only one that recognizes him, which is why I have to bring the dog into that story, right? Because it's literally his dog that he left behind. And I think that just goes to show that, I mean, Calypso's there as a person that he finds attractive physically and so forth. And he was distracted for 7 years. Let's be honest, he was distracted for 7 years. But ultimately, it's not his family. He doesn't have obligations like for the Aztecs, and I think we all recognize this. When you step into a role as a parent or something like that, that incurs certain kinds of obligations, right? So part of the way in which the Aztecs are going to end up talking about things that we owe each other is because you happen to embody a certain position, a certain role, father, whatever, spouse, that entails, like, that means things. And in order to fulfill what that means, those constitutive qualities are obligations. So the obligations follow out of those roles that you have with people that you live with. And so a rooted life concerns sort of, ultimately for them, there's twofold. One of them is you're already born into that, so you already have your obligations. But the second one is just sort of prudential. It's, look, your mind is chaos. And unlike Buddhists or Stoics, and this is an accent in Buddhism and Stoicism, I want to be very clear. I sort of think that Buddhism and Stoicism start on what's called the inward path, and Aztecs are on the outward path. But for them, you're trying to like still your mind. You learn to meditate. For the Stoics, you're trying to catch your thoughts so that you don't try to control the things that are not under your control, right? Those are inward activities, and you're going to try to go out. For the Aztecs, they're sort of, they have, well, to the extent that they have a conception of mind that is like what we think of as mind, it's chaos. And you would do better to establish relationships with people around you, your family, your community, etc. Bring that stuff and start there, and then step inward eventually to stabilize yourself. And so it's not just that you have these obligations to other people. It's the only way that you can really live a consistent life as a human. So rootedness kind of has those 4 levels. Mind, friends, family, the close relationships, your society, and nature. They liked 4s. I try to jam them into 3s sometimes, but the Aztecs preferred 4s. And like those are levels at which you take root, right, and you're balanced. But that's kind of what you just need to do to live as a human being, right? You also have the obligations that follow, but it's also your only path forward to living well.
So one way of thinking about this is that there's a tension between 2 different goods, and the other one is that there is a correct choice. And so I wonder whether the Aztecs would see this sort of tension, whether it's a matter of saying that if you were to pursue your own individual joy, you'd be walking down the wrong path, as opposed to saying that, well, the obligations you have to your community, to your family, are both stronger than the benefit that you gain, and also ultimately better for you in that you'd lead a more meaningful life. Is there a sense of sacrifice in the discussion or not?
Yeah, I think you're right on that. It is both prudential, that as a human being, you're not going to be able to lead a life as well. Now, for them, a certain amount of that, probably more than most Western philosophers are comfortable with, is involved in sort of moral luck, right? That's an inescapable component for them. But at the same time, they're just going to say, look, you incurred obligations through your relationships with other people, right? And those obligations stand regardless of whether or not you want to pursue them, right? They're objective in that sense. You are a father or a husband or something like that, Odysseus. And if you ignore that, well, you're just ignoring the state of things, right? So in order to continue being a good father or a good husband, you have to do things. That's just what that means. And so there is an objectively better choice in that sense. So right action evaluation comes kind of way down the line, right? You have a conception of the good, you're trying to pursue the good in this way, you get involved with a bunch of relationships with people, and then that cashes out like specific obligations. It becomes harder to generalize than about obligations for all people, because, insofar as we're humans, we can talk about things, but those generalities for them maybe are better confined to a discussion of virtues. It's just that the virtues enable you to enact the specific social role obligations that you happen to have.
It seems like fulfilling your obligations towards close others is not sufficient for a happy life. So you can imagine Odysseus's child being the devil's spawn. You can imagine Odysseus's wife being a witch. It seems like he might be obligated to go back to them, but he's not going to live a happy life. So it seems like you need to add a value on top of just the mere sustaining of relationships. Those relationships actually have to be good in some way, and we have to cash out what that goodness is. And the worry is that when you cash that out, it comes back to smiles. So what makes them good is that it makes everyone smile. And now it looks like we've collapsed the account back to a hedonistic account.
So ultimately for the Aztecs, how they end up justifying this sort of thing, at least on my interpretation, and just to be clear for the audience, I am working from a tradition. So I'm trying to reconstruct Aztec philosophy as a living philosophy. That's the endeavor here, drawing from texts just after the conquest. And I am operating in a tradition that kind of existed since, the late 1880s in Mexico. So just in aware we're grounded in this thing. But from this point of view, you can find passages that say things like, look, wisdom is held in the books of red and black ink. So at a certain point, they have a conception of the good life, which is something that more or less pulls on three things: observations that you have about human beings generally, what's held in the books of wisdom traditions, and then what you can kind of logically justify. Right. And so those three poles kind of give you a conception of what is valuable. And it's sort of a holistic account in that sense, maybe a coherentist account of the good. Pleasure plays a role in that, but they're not going to say that that's the base idea. They're going to say that these three sorts of things enable us to make sense of the world, and that's the tradition that we come from. And in that sense, it is a little bit closer to certain conceptions broadly in virtue ethics. I'm not too sure, but that's how they would do that, is they would say, like, look, sure, pleasure plays a role. Other things being equal, we have passages where a father's talking to his daughter, and he basically says, of course you want a pleasurable life over that. But you live in a community with people that has obligations and things like that. And so it's our best chance. They also say things like this. This is their ethical pessimism, which is they say, look, there's a great deal that is not under your control. And even the stuff that matters, like the important things. And you can slip up. That's their saying, is that you might slip up. The example that I give in the book, I believe, is the story of Trent Reznor, which I find fascinating. He, in 1999, for those of you who don't know, he was... I'm like, my age is coming out here. It's like barely Gen X. He was on the front cover of Spin magazine, international rock star, got all like best or most vital artist of the year awards, etc. But he had an interview because he was depressed at the time, and the interviewer asked him, what more do you want? And he would wake up every morning and decide whether or not he was going to shoot himself. And he would say no. He just kind of like procrastinated suicide for a very long period of time. And he told the interviewer, well, look, it's not about being content. It's about, what if everything you ever wanted, you got, and it still sucked. And so Reznor managed to fail by way of success. That's a specific kind of failure that we call disillusionment, right? And that's the Aztec point, is that you're a human being. You're going to mess up. Even by succeeding at your goals, you're going to slip up. And here's the thing. What makes your life worth living also makes it fragile. That's just the inherent risk you need to expose yourself to in order to pursue the things that make your life valuable. So you might have a wife who's a witch, or a child who's a terror. But that's sort of the bet that you take when you enter those kind of relationships. We adopted a child, for example. That was a very deliberate thing. I love my daughter to death. She's turned out very well, I think. But we didn't know that. We're adopting, of all things. There's a whole lot of that was out of our control with that. And that's sort of the Aztec point, is if you want the things that make your life rich and valuable, there's an inherent risk, and there's just no way around that. So it may turn out that Odysseus is returning to, a terrible home life, but he still has certain obligations. And I mean, those are frankly the risks that he incurred when he sort of entered into those relationships in the beginning. It's a long-winded response, but I hope that kind of clarifies.
So it seems that the obligations you have to your family are very strong, and as you say, good for you as a person to maintain them. I imagine that there would be obligations to not just your family, but to those within the broader Aztec community. What about those outside that community? Um, was there a sort of ethical demarcation between insiders and outsiders? How do you work out who counts as having moral value in that system?
Yeah, I mean, and so that pushes out do they have a conception of like human dignity or something? Is there there's some sort of Kantianism going on in the background? And um, I tend to think that they cash this out as relationships to foreigners who still have obligations to them. And heck, you have relationships to the natural environment too, for what it's worth. So I don't know if that entails specifically like intrinsic value claims about the natural environment. But yes, you do have obligations to all of these features of the world, other people, even other people you don't know. They just tend to be modulated differently. Strangers are strangers that have specific social role obligations that you need to respect. We have stories about Montezuma, for example, where he sent spies behind enemy lines to go get surrounding kings, because he wasn't always a king, right? So when he had to become one, he had to send other people out. He became king, and then he needed to rally support. So he got all of these surrounding allies to come, and they had this whole series of festivals, and they actually had this whole shroom festival thing. They all got high and did shrooms, and they thought they were great buds, and they all supported him afterwards. And then he sent them back because they were secretly there in his place, and then he had to send them back behind enemy lines. And so in the discussion of what's recorded there, we see that there are a whole series of obligations that his spies had to maintain going out as messengers into foreign lands, that other people had to maintain respect to them, even though they were quasi-hostile. These relationships held up. And so that, I think that just goes to show that there's this sense that humans always have some sort of obligation. It may be overridden, right? But there's some sort of basic obligation to other beings, not just humans even, but other beings, including natural environment, rivers and mountains and all kinds of stuff.
So I think you dealt with the sufficiency objection well. So I was arguing that fulfilling your relationships with others is not sufficient for happiness, and I think you answered that nicely. But there's also a necessity problem. So if we alter the thought experiment, so that it's not Odysseus spending time with Calypso, just enjoying himself and living a life full of pleasure, and it's not a choice in the second version of the case between experiencing immense pleasure but without anyone knowing where you are. Instead, it's a choice between going off for a life of exploration and leaving your family behind versus staying. So we can imagine the lone astronaut who goes to the stars. We can imagine maybe a parallel case, the Picasso type case of someone going off to explore beauty or the arts, but leaving his wife behind. And there's a lot of artists who've done this, or the monk who goes to experience something greater than himself, perhaps, and leaves his family behind. So what's interesting about those cases is we judge those cases far less harshly, I think. So when we ask people what their intuitions are about the space explorer, the astronaut, we think he's doing something noble, even though he's leaving his wife behind. And maybe what's happening there is that there's some other value that he's tapping into that supersedes relationship fulfillment and fulfilling his obligations. It's something about exploring knowledge or exploring science or exploring the arts or beauty, which it intuitively seems at least as good as, if not better, than fulfilling mundane relationships. So it suggests that true happiness might not require fulfilling our relationships and our obligations.
Yeah, how would the Aztecs go on this? I love the point there, Jason. Here's what I would say. I think that we at this point kind of almost need to shift a little bit into the mechanics of how they thought about virtues, etc. Because up until this point, we've been talking about the good and good life. They try to make the claim that the outward path is outward, not just by its starting point, but actually mechanics of operation. Aztecs would say that lone individuals probably underestimate the way in which they are limiting their resources to act well. The key argument here is that prudence or practical wisdom is best exercised in groups. So there's a book chapter titled "The Wise Don't Think for Themselves." And since all of the virtues are infused with practical wisdom, that means that if you're not in the right groups, you're probably not going to have any of the other virtues either. And so the way this goes is they actually have, as far as I can see, and this is again my reconstruction, uh, virtues of shared agency. So not just character-based virtues, but relational virtues. And shared agency in the action theory domain may or may not resolve into individual agency. I try to make the case in the book, though, that for ethical purposes, it's very clear that, okay, so shared agency, just for the audience, okay, really quickly, you're walking down Broadway in Manhattan, okay? There are a lot of people around you. You're not taking a stroll with those people. They're just, even if some of them are walking in the same direction as you, they're just other people walking in the same direction. Whereas if you are walking with somebody else, they are, in fact, that is a shared activity, right? And part of that shared activity involves a conception of, I don't know, again, whether or not this catches out to individuals, but sort of we're walking or taking a stroll together. And there's some sort of view in which you're thinking of yourself as a group. Okay. Action theory aside, for ethical purposes, it seems that the way that works into making evaluations is different than mere individual agency. And so there's an argument in the book that hinges on that. But at base, you can more or less just say things like, look, if you're making decisions in groups, it will be obvious that you're coming to conclusions that you wouldn't have been able to come to on your own. And that means that the reasons behind your actions in acting from a group are different from the reasons you have as an individual. Hence, there's a different ethical valence involved. So for ethical purposes, shared agency matters as its own kind of special class of stuff. And hence the relationships that you maintain, the virtues that follow from that are sort of different than individual shared agency. That's the claim, of course. I'm a philosopher. We'll argue endlessly about that. But that's the claim that's at the center there. If I can use that, I can then say, structurally speaking, all of the virtues are different for the Aztecs. So when you're walking away from your friends and family and community, you're walking away from the resources that enable you to think and act well, perform well, etc. And so an example, I don't know if it made its way into the book, but I give talks on sort of what I call like vice ethics or vice management. Okay. So it seems that one of the things that the Aztecs had in mind was you don't really have to become good all on your own. You can just get people to help you. So this is the first Halloween that my wife and I moved into the neighborhood where we live. And we've been living in large cities together for a long time. We moved into a traditional neighborhood where people sit on their porches and walk their dogs and stroll by. Anyway, so for Halloween, we were told to expect hundreds of children coming by. And so we heard on getting too much candy rather than too little, and many of them did come by. But afterwards, we just poured the excess onto this platter in the middle of our living room. And in order to go anywhere in our house, you have to pass through the living room. So I found myself over the next so many days constantly eating candy. I have no willpower, no ability to resist sweet things. And I told my wife, I hate myself for this, but I can't stop eating these things. So she's the chair at her department, and she just actually took the platter one day. I came back and there was no platter. It was like empty. I was like, what happened? She said, no, I just took it, dumped it off at the philosophy department for the kiddos there. And like that, my whole cycle, like guilt and transgression, was over. And so I was going to act better, but not because, I did something better, but because the group around me of people did something better. My life was going to go better. And that's kind of what I want to say is that's the Aztec view, right? Is that by departing from a good group of people, you cut out the resources that you have for living a good life. So I don't really know what the Aztecs would say about sort of lone monks or something like that going off into the desert or exploring it individually. I think they would worry that you can't actually lead a good life that way, or that at the very least you will lead a very deficient life. And
pushing that a bit more, I agree that there is a loss. There's no doubt that there's a loss. the question is, are you losing something necessary for happiness? And it seems like it's not clear that you are. There might be another course to living a good life. So it seems like the noble astronaut is living a good life, but yes, he's missing the relationships and the fulfillment of obligations that he would have had if he'd stayed home. But if he doesn't go, we'll never further our knowledge about the place he's going to explore. Picasso, yes, he left his wife, and yes, that really impacted her and their relationship. I don't know the full history of Picasso, but my understanding is that it was really bad for her and for their relationship. I think it was catastrophic. Someone can correct me in the comments on this, but let's just assume it was. But he would never have made his paintings if he'd stayed. And so that would have been a tremendous loss to the world. And we can say he led a good life because he produced those paintings. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is it could be that the fulfillment of obligations and relationships, because it takes up time and mental energy and effort, could deprive us of other values that are very important.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it seems that the Aztecs had some sense about this, in which they would kind of suspend typical judgments. We have cases, for example, where the king would, the Tlatoani king, speaker, leader, something like that, would suspend the ordinary course of punishment because somebody had composed a superlatively excellent piece of poetry. But it was an all things considered judgment in that sort of scenario. Those, so in short, we have those cases, and it seems they were aware of that, especially for what we would call aesthetic sensibilities. I sort of wonder about how that concept translates into the Nahua world. But yeah, they did do that, and they did recognize those values. So it's not as if familial obligations trump everything. It's just that, exceptions are going to have to be made on sort of a case-by-case basis. And apparently they did that sort of thing, exactly that sort of thing for poetry, written form. That's all we have evidence for. Yeah, we don't have evidence for like paintings, but at least that portion of it. And but it's also helpful to recognize that the judgment in that case was made by a member of the community about suspending that. Maybe not exactly the familial members, but a member of the community, a relevant and important member of the community, was able to make a decision about suspending our typical sets of judgments.
So you might think that communities have a corrosive force in various ways. So you can imagine growing up in, let's say, a neo-Nazi sect that is very closed off from the rest of the world. And so your beliefs about history are distorted. Let's say that now the Holocaust. Their moral beliefs are tainted. They think that all Black people are deserving of death. And you might think that for you to lead a meaningful life, it's important to exit that community. And maybe you can't become whole on your own. Maybe being a lone astronaut isn't sufficient. You need to go find some other community. And I suppose what's difficult about community bubbles, especially ones that aren't open and porous, is that it might be hard to know whether you're in a bad community with bad epistemic norms and bad moral norms. And so you might think that it's important to have some kind of extra value of leaving. So, for example, as far as I understand, the Amish have a year where they require adherents to leave so they can sort of explore the outside world and find out whether their Amish values stack up. And some people return, some people don't. So did the Aztecs see community in that narrow sense of the way that we objectively determine the good life and what is true is from the existing community that you have, and that you ought not to travel beyond it, and that you might be exposing yourself to the sinister evil communities out there? Or was that seen as a virtue in itself?
Yeah, no, I don't know of anything like the Amish practice of the room spring or whatever it is among the Aztecs. We do have quite a bit of material about traveling to other cities, how they prepared children, how they led that sort of discussion, etc. And I think that from just the perspective of a philosopher, the idea is it's a good individual and a good group, right? So you do need, so from an evaluative point of view, if you grew up in sort of a neo-Nazi community that was supportive otherwise, but the Aztecs would say effectively, it's not a good community. The question is, how do you know that you're not in a good community? And frankly, it's hard. They are going to say things like, remember, there's the wisdom of tradition, but there's also logic and your own experiences that should inform your judgments. And while they didn't require people to travel abroad or something like that, because it was quite perilous, pre-modern periods, traveling to other areas was fraught. You could just die on the road for any other bandits, snakes, disease. It was fraught. So there's no such requirement, but that they certainly did quite a bit of it. Many of the peoples there were the people that we think of the Aztecs were originally sort of a nomadic group that came down from. So the Aztec language, Nahuatl, is part of what's called the Uto-Aztecan family of languages. The Utas were in Utah, right? So that group of people who travel south from, what we think of like Salt Lake City, Utah, something like that, all the way down into the central valley of Mexico and back up. And there's this cycling corridor of them. So that was normal. That is what they did for, well, it appears potentially thousands of years, at least more than 1,000 years. And that means that they were exposed to other people, etc. through their. So it was like they traveled, but they also had other travelers consistently moving into their space, so that they didn't have closed communities. I would say that there was no, as far as I know, there were no prescriptions to do that. But since it's a matter of understanding, it's probably a good rule. I could imagine the Aztecs adopting a rule like everyone should have the robe spring or something like that. I think that would be consistent with their outlook, even if they didn't have it. I think, in fact, people were always traveling around them, etc., and so it never really emerged in any of the surviving texts that we have left. But it does seem to be consistent with that view, because yes, there is the worry that an overly communitarian view ends up in closing you into sort of a bad epistemic circle of evaluation, right? That is the constant threat. I will say it's a counterpoint to the West. We tend to identify the lone individual, the Martin Luther who says, "Here I stand," right? But it's important to recognize that typically that lone individual they're unique because they're rare, right? And we have an overwhelming amount of scientific evidence that suggests when you put together good groups of researchers, etc., even musicians, you get better songs, better music, etc., working collaboratively in groups. It's like the virtuous epistemic circle really does have advantages.
So related to this problem of knowing whether your group's obligations and sets of rules for one another is a good set of rules or obligations, what often comes to people's minds when they think of the Aztecs is human sacrifice. So firstly, was there human sacrifice? Is it just a myth? Was there actually? And if there was, how does that gel with the idea that, well, if you just go along with all, the moral code of your society with all of its obligations, that you're necessarily going to have the right result, because it seems intuitively that human sacrifice is the wrong result.
Right. Yeah. And it's hilarious. I posted just an image of the cover of the book on my Instagram profile. Got a lot of likes, but then just a deluge of various people who just this one topic, that's all they want to talk about. I didn't really even want to, it's not included in the core body of the book. The editor suggested that because it is a well-known feature, I should include it somewhere, so I put it in an appendix. Right. Because as far as I'm concerned, the practice has no bearing on the ethical framework. Now, it's a little bit, in short, like we can look at similar age practices in Europe around the 1500s. You look at like public executions as being brutal and unnecessary, and nobody says that we shouldn't pay attention to European philosophy because they did this stuff, right? Just because we should ignore Descartes because public executions were happening. And nobody says similarly that we should not read Stoics because they had the Roman Colosseum games in virtually every large city for 500 years where they just murdered each other for sport. That's because they were literally bored. And there were no denunciations by philosophers at that time of the Colosseum games, apart from the fact that they were low class, Right? So if you go ahead and you read Seneca, you'll be like, oh, that's just what the rabble do. So there's no moral denunciation of the games. And I just kind of want to put that in context, because the way in which we're all aware that the way in which the history gets written is by the conquerors, and the Spaniards wrote the history, and they had self-legitimating reasons to emphasize certain features of the society that they invaded to legitimate their activities. So I think that that's the historical reason why there is a fascination with Aztec sacrifice, is just kind of like this historical trajectory. And I don't, in that sense, want to say that it was a good thing. I think that the Aztec framework that I articulate gives us grounds as philosophers to criticize that, just as, if we use a contemporary Aristotelian framework, we can criticize Aristotle for his defense of slavery, or Kant for his defense of racism, like his racist views. I mean, heck, he was the architect of modern racism. So in that same vein, that's kind of where I want to put that. All right, so now let's get to the practice. Yes, it happened. No, it didn't happen at the scale that the Spaniards said. It was quite varied, and it really needs to be understood in like the context of what they call blood sacrifice. But blood sacrifice typically involve like pricking, like a priest would take a spine and prick their ear for blood and put that on like some plant offering, cactus, burn it, etc. So it was like that was the sort of trajectory in which this was understood, and it is part of their cosmology in that sense. So that outlook then turns on largely what I understand to be false cosmological principles, as most pre-modern people had false cosmologies. And how about a couple of things? One, in our stories that we have recorded about human sacrifice, insofar as they're related to this and the sun needing blood to move, it actually doesn't require human sacrifice. It's only the gods that sacrifice themselves. So how the actual practice got off the ground is not exactly related to the cosmological stories that people usually point to. So there's a gap there. It gets filled in, obviously, historically in some way, but I just want to say, like, the cosmologies don't directly support it. The next bit is, so sometimes philosophers try to make the argument, because I have a lot of conversations about this with other philosophers, and they try to make the argument that, like, look, okay, you have to sacrifice human beings in order to keep the sun moving because you need their heart blood or whatever. Okay, fine. But why is it blood that's necessary? And it's always going to go back to not an ethical reason, but just their conception of the cosmos, right? So your reason for that has to be not the thing that I want to do as a philosopher is show you that it's detachable. The ethical framework is detachable from their cosmology, because the only reason you're going to have a cosmological claim is because you have cosmological principles in mind, not ethical principles in mind. If your ethical principle has to be something like this: we should keep human society going, right? That's the ethical question in mind. We have to keep human society going in some ways. That seems to be the key portion. And if anything else beyond that is a lot of texts and a lot of nuance, that's kind of where I would leave it. The one question, maybe a friend of mine, Sophia, she's at Vassar, she was telling me her view is like, well, maybe it's a little bit like the Bhagavad Gita, the opening scene there, where you have to, it raises the question with Krishna about, like, what is the point of human existence if there's a lot of pain and suffering or something like that, right? And why, if we're locked into an existential position where we know some people are going to have to suffer, why are we going to continue forward, right? Why doesn't like an antinatalism follow from that? And I think the answer in that case is probably something like, I think the Aztecs wouldn't be like, they're open to the fact that, right, that our lives are fragile, bad things can happen to you, etc. But those things don't have to happen. And they don't have to happen at the scale that would invalidate all human lives from being good. Right? I think that antinatalism only follows if you get a pretty extreme view that all humans are condemned to live bad lives. And they didn't hold that, as far as I can tell.
So it seems that there's an interesting tension in the sacrifice case. The one is, if the Aztecs took a different metaphysical view, then the practice might have changed. So they might have thought, well, in order to keep humanity going, we have to do this really terrible thing, but ultimately it's worth it. But if you say, well, actually, you don't need to kill people to make the sun go around, they say, oh, well, that's very nice to know. Then no problem. And then there's sort of, I think you could use most moral frameworks, if it were true that the world would end and required you to sacrifice an innocent, it at least seems compelling to think that there's a reason to do it. Maybe some very hard-nosed Kantians say, well, then let humanity perish. But I think anyone with a consequentialist bent will say, well, we have to make the sacrifice. I suppose in any sort of assessment of a cultural practice that seems strange, it's worth understanding the background conditions so that we can see whether it does fit into, an ordinary framework. I remember one of my ethics tutors sort of giving us the case of Aboriginal societies that kill twins. And so you sort of find this happening in various parts of the world. And it seems like really a barren practice to sort of leave them out to die in the snow or in the wilderness. And the argument was, well, you've got very limited resources. And so, in order for the whole community to survive, when you have, an unexpected, excess infant, this is the terrible sacrifice that the community makes. And then I suppose what happens sometimes is that the two become detached. So, you develop a norm of that's what we always do with twins, even under conditions when you do have a surplus. And, there might be many Western traditions where we've adopted a rule because generally that leads towards the good, but in the particular circumstance, we should depart from the rule.
Yeah, and I think that that's probably something that happened with Aztec society. It's something similar. Somebody should do the work of looking at how the practice began. It was very small scale. It did get larger over a period of time. It looks like, I can't speak definitively to this, but it looks like it was partly motivated by political reasons for a certain member of the Mexica at a time. By the way, the Aztecs tended to refer, they didn't call themselves Aztecs, right? They referred to themselves as members of specific cities, right? So the members of Tenochtitlan referred to themselves as the Mexica. Certain political leaders used the practice as kind of took over it and used it to their advantage, it looks like, so that they could kind of maintain and consolidate power. And well, yeah, okay, that's a thing that happened. Which is a little bit like your surplus example. We continue the rule despite not needing it. In this case, it may be that a practice existed and it was co-opted to support, sort of a power grab, which humans have done everywhere. And, from an ethical framework, you have grounds to say well, neither of those things should have happened. You shouldn't be consolidating power in that way. And you shouldn't be, it's people are bad actors, right? So there's one of the difficulties is disambiguating bad actors. And their use of a pre-existing practice from, the actual historical record. It's going to be mushy. As a philosopher, I can just say well, look, here are the things that we have recorded in the texts that are ethical. They just don't seem to point to any of this or need any recourse to that. And so what I'm trying to do is develop a neo-Aztec philosophy here. So as a neo-Aztec philosopher, I just don't need to talk about that thing. I don't. It's there for cultural reasons and historical reasons, but I have plenty of grounds to criticize those things. And whatever was actually recorded in society is the society. I think just a final thread on that point. Because we can't speak to specific philosophers, realistically, the way the texts were recorded, the names of who said what thing or who held which thing are never recorded, and they're kind of all kind of mushed together. We end up presenting things like Aztec philosophy. I'm very confident that the thing that I'm reconstructing is the philosophy from a series of the equivalent of their discourses, like Discourses of the Elders. This is a genre. So the philosophy of the discourses as collected in these cities over this period of time, right? As collected in 3 main cities between 1535 and 1600. That's as close as I can come to saying it's somebody's philosophy, right? And we have evidence in these same texts that maybe at Huatzinco or other, those people held different views, right? Ethically different views. I can say that I look at those texts and I look at these texts and these are just not consistent. They're recorded in the same things. And so we have to just kind of, well, as a philosopher, what I do is I just peel away from that. I have to say well, I reject that as something else, right? That's just an interpretive thing that I have to do. But I just want to note that because when we're talking about a cultural practice like human sacrifice, that's the thing that the culture did. And usually, philosophers can retreat to the philosopher. I can't quite do that, but I can't quite do that just because of what I'm left with for evidence. And I think that's part of the rub in this discussion.
So, as the resident utilitarian in the room, I want to promote my worldview as superior. So, I want to give a case. I want you to consider situations where the fulfillment of obligations towards those who are close to you would result in net unhappiness to everyone involved. So, for example, let's say I'm the wife of of an abusive husband, and perhaps I have an obligation, both according to my community and according to my husband, to return to him time after time. Um, the relationship is toxic. I'm abused. My husband is unhappy. It's a bad situation all around. Um, it seems like I should not return to him time after time. That will negate an obligation. I won't fulfill an obligation by doing so. Um, but what's quite important for this is that the reason why I shouldn't return is because it results in net unhappiness. Now, there's two ways of interpreting the Aztec position. The one is I should never leave, and that would be quite counterintuitive. The more charitable would be I can leave because he's shirked his responsibilities and his obligations, and so that allows me to do the same. But it's an incomplete explanation for why I should leave, and that is that it's missing the fact that there's net unhappiness if I stay, which the utilitarian captures nicely. So the utilitarian says, yes, fulfilling our obligations and maintaining close bonds is important because it results in net pleasure or net happiness or net utility, however you want to cash it out. And when it doesn't, that's precisely when you shouldn't fulfill those obligations. And it seems like the Aztec view is not going to have that very clear explanation for why we should sometimes shirk our responsibilities.
It was strange going into the texts. You typically have that, you have this discussion about things like virtues, and you have this discussion about things like obligation, which typically gets cashed out in terms of, or often gets cashed out in terms of honor language, like doing such a thing would be dishonorable. That follows from like failing to live up to your social role or something like that. So then it was a matter of coordinating the registers, and the way that I understand it is first, your first thing is to enact the virtues in a performative sense. So products matter for the Aztecs, but they tend to have like pleasure as an emotional state. An elevated emotional state might be considered an independent product from just how do you perform your life, right? Both matter. They have a mixed view of things. They're sort of uneasily between Kant and some sort of consequentialist framework. So I don't claim that they've solved that. I'm just noting that's where they stand. Both matter, but you have to perform your life well. The things that articulate what a good performance means, those are the virtues. Those virtues require that you enact relationships with other people, right? To sustain that, and relationships with other people, if they're going to be good, entail obligations. So it's sort of like the virtues are first and the social role obligations are secondary, sort of there to support the virtues. And I think that if you have a situation such that your obligations are no longer supporting the enactment of like a good life, you're in an abusive relationship or something like that, you're actually, you probably are obligated to leave, right? Because the reason you're in that relationship is to lead a better life. So you have to leave because that relationship is undermining that more fundamental goal. And so, and in fact, pleasure may be ceteris paribus, a reason to do that. Right? I don't want it's not that pleasure has no role, it's just that it doesn't have like an exclusive role for the Nahus.
So I'm interested to know if the Aztec moral framework helps us solve applied ethics topics. So can we use that framework to work out whether we should allow abortion, extramarital sex, or the eating of meat?
So those are three very different topics. Right? Yeah, I mean, abortion is an interesting case because I mean we're gonna have to talk about like, do you have obligations to specific individuals or not, and right? And that would be a little different there. If you do have obligations to persons for the Aztecs, not that they can't be overridden in all circumstances. Obviously, people can be, captured, put to death, etc. Like that can even happen if you have overriding reasons. But presumably, if a fetus is a person, then yeah, they're going to have a hard time saying that you don't have some sort of social obligation to that. It may be overridden in very, very special circumstances, but those are probably tragic circumstances, right? So that probably means that there's no right action, there's just bad actions. And some are better or worse bad actions, but we're still in the trafficking in the realm of bad actions. So yeah, probably abortion, yes, is possible. Not good, depending on how we catch out the metaphysical status of a fetus or something like that. Meat, yeah. Again, you do have obligations to animals in the natural environment, as far as I can tell. Probably, I'm not too sure if they have a sense of. So this is where I think it becomes really clear in the consequentialist framework, where we can, like, animal rights gets off the ground and does very well when we're talking about obligations to animals. And I presumably you have some sort of obligation in that regard. I don't know. I'd like to say that there's some proscription on cruelty, right? Because it would seem that there's very little reason to say that somehow makes your life or anyone else's life go better by performing cruel action. That you can eat animals is probably okay. That you can be cruel is, it's really hard to say, like, how that helps you live a better life. Like, what virtue does that support, right? And hence industrial scale, raising of livestock and that sort of thing is probably to be condemned, if that makes sense. Oh, extramarital sex. Yeah, that actually happened. In the Aztecs, it's very strange because it really depended on your social role. So totally, the main line is, for most people, no, you probably shouldn't engage in it, but it really depends on your social role and your status at the time. Again, they didn't have things like contraception, whatever else. So prudential considerations have sort of an overriding reason. There's no universal proscription on that among the Aztecs, as far as I'm concerned. As a matter of fact, the whole conception of sexuality is very strange for them. They wouldn't have considered, for example, we have evidence that the treating of a scorpion-invited bite in some circumstances might have involved sexual relations with some other medical type person helping you out. But they didn't consider that sex, although we would. So, the whole idea of sexuality does not translate well after a certain point. Pete Siegel's book on this, The Scorpion and the Flower, is illuminating, although, like most anthropological historical things, maybe some things are right and some things are wrong there, but it was at least illuminating for me to read that, to say, like, oh, they don't really have a concept of sexuality. They didn't have a concept of, like, so what we call, like, homosexuality just wasn't even a thing. An idea about the sexual orientation didn't translate at all into the culture. So that one just becomes hard to talk about. But I think the baseline root case is, like, does it help you lead a better life? That's what you're after. If it's consistent with leading a good life, fine, probably fine.
Tell us more about the sexual ethics. It sounds like an unusual field, and we've kind of covered sexual ethics quite a bit on the show. What are the things that sort of stand out? Can you elaborate on the practices? How much of this stuff, as you say, wouldn't have been viewed as sexual, but viewed as something else? So our modern lens would distort it, but interesting to know more about the topic.
Yeah. So, what I can say about this is that so things that we know, for example, is that various Tlatoani, or kings, speakers, literally means speaker for the community, in the way, although you probably shouldn't think that it's too democratic by the time we get to Tenochtitlan. It's pretty hierarchical. These figures would, I don't know. So there's a few things to say here. First of all, once you're an aristocrat or in that kind of higher group, non-monogamy seems to be the norm in their practices, because again, they had the resources to sustain larger relationships and family structures and that sort of things. So that's probably the case. They would be polygamous at that level, but most regular people, the Massachualten, would be living monogamous lives. They can't really the idea was both that you can't sustain them from like just a resource perspective, but they had a lot of discussion that maybe you as a person don't have the ability or the power of the king. It's hard to peel out the propaganda there. But so that idea, the kings themselves took variously men or women into their groups. None of that was ever discussed as strange or weird. That's just what they did. They had preferences for people, and that was it. It just never even evolved, as far as I can tell, as a topic until we get like post-colonial discussions. But a topic for discussion, they just didn't think of sexuality as being oriented one way or another, and hence, as a result, we would describe it as maybe they had a conception of a fluid sexuality, but that's saying more than what's actually the case. They just didn't have a view, right? So they just didn't say like, oh, these people are heterosexual and these people are not. There's just none of that stuff. So there's no sense of like transitioning sexuality or anything else as far as we know. And then, yeah, it does appear that they would have, it looks like some cases, treatment with baths or something like that. Treating poisons may have involved sexual activities, and they thought of it as medicine. They didn't class that as sexual activity, which is where you just start recognizing that they didn't have a concept like ours of sexuality in general. So, the overriding view seems to be that as long as it was useful or helped you live a better life, it was okay. It depended on your social role in society, which obligations you entailed. And I would say the warriors sort of lived in like huts or communities, and they would have specific pleasure women who would visit them, the Aoyani. And yeah, we might consider these women sort of sex workers, but that's not really how they considered them because that concept didn't translate. But yeah, so the idea is the warriors are going to go out, they fight, they lead really fast lives, they fight and they die. But that's why they, although not kings, get to have access to many women, whereas ordinary people who do feather work or goldsmithing don't have access. So again, it's very social role differentiated, what your obligations might be in the society. So that's kind of how they cashed it out, rather than having high level concepts. They just, what's your social role? Does it help you live a better life, etc.? What can you sustain? And that was roughly their approach. And of course, they didn't have contemporary medicine that we have, contraception, etc.
Well, Sebastian, I want to thank you for a really fascinating conversation. I think it's wonderful that you're engaged in the project of furthering knowledge and of adding extra squares into the philosophical quilt. And I hope that our listeners go and purchase a copy of your book.
Yeah, well, thank you both, Mark and Jason, for having me on. This is super helpful. I love having the conversation here. Good to talk some philosophy.